Harlem in the late 1930s did not sleep easily. It pretended to. The street lamps glowed amber over Lenox Avenue. Jazz drifted from basement clubs thick with cigarette smoke, and laughter floated through cracked windows as though the world beyond those bricks did not exist. But beneath the music, beneath the rhythm, beneath the illusion of celebration, there was always tension. A quiet understanding. A line no one crossed unless they were prepared to pay for it. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson understood lines. He had spent his life studying them, the invisible ones drawn by race, by power, by money, by fear. He knew which could be negotiated and which were designed to suffocate. And more importantly, he knew that survival in New York City did not belong to the loudest man in the room. It belonged to the most patient. That winter had been especially sharp, the kind of cold that cut through wool coats and settled into bone. Inside their modest brownstone apartment, however, warmth lingered. Mame Johnson sat near the window, hands resting gently over the subtle curve of her pregnant belly, watching snow fall in slow, deliberate spirals. There was strength in her posture, a dignity that did not need decoration. She carried herself not as the wife of a powerful man, but as a woman who understood her own worth. Bumpy stood behind her, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He had always dressed with intention, crisp lines, polished shoes, hat angled, just enough to signal confidence without arrogance. He believed presentation was armor in a city that tried daily to strip men like him of identity. "You should rest," he told her quietly, voice calm and low. Mame turned slightly, offering him a knowing smile. "I will, after you promise me something." He raised an eyebrow. "That whatever comes through that door tonight," she said, glancing toward the entrance as if it were capable of listening, "you handle it the way you always do." "And how is that? With your mind," she replied softly. "Not your anger." Bumpy's expression did not change, but his eyes warmed. He crossed the room, placed his hand gently over hers, and nodded once. "I've never been ruled by anger." It was true. Harlem had seen men rise quickly on rage and fall even faster because of it. Bumpy was different, he calculated. He measured. He waited. What neither of them knew was that by the following evening, patience would be tested in a way neither wealth nor reputation could shield them from. The conflict did not begin with a gunshot. It began with disrespect. Dutch Schultz's organization had been pressing into territories long understood to be under Harlem's informal governance. Schultz was a formidable figure in New York's underworld, ambitious, sharp, and unafraid to use influence to expand operations. But where Schultz operated with cold business logic, some of his younger enforcers operated with ego. One of them was Vincent Collaro. Collaro was not powerful, not truly, but he carried proximity to power. Like a weapon. He had grown arrogant under borrowed protection, mistaking association for authority. He had also grown comfortable pushing against lines he did not fully understand. Earlier that week, one of Bumpy's trusted associates had refused to yield a supply route that Harlem families depended upon for legitimate business. It was not gambling money or illegal profit, it was food distribution. Collaro took the refusal personally. And men who take business personally tend to make emotional mistakes. The evening it happened, Bumpy had stepped out briefly to meet a local pastor about funding repairs for a church roof. He believed community investment strengthened loyalty far more effectively than intimidation ever could. Mame remained home, preparing tea, moving carefully but confidently. The hallway outside their apartment was narrow, old wood worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Snow had melted into damp patches along the stairwell. When the knock came, it was sharp and impatient. Mame moved toward the door. She did not expect hostility. She expected conversation. When she opened it, Vincent Collaro stood there, coat collar raised, eyes already narrowed with condescension. "Mr. Johnson home?" he asked, tone laced with dismissal. "He isn't," Mame answered evenly. But if you have business, you may state it respectfully. Respectfully, the word seemed to irritate him. I don't discuss business with. He stopped short, his gaze flicking downward briefly to her stomach. Something twisted in his expression. Tell him he doesn't own this neighborhood. She did not flinch. Harlem belongs to its people. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then arrogance made its move. Colaro stepped forward as though to enter uninvited. Maine shifted instinctively to block him. The stairwell behind her offered little space. His shoulders struck her, not wildly, not theatrically, but with enough force to destabilize. Her hand reached for the banister, but the wood was slick from melted snow, and gravity does not negotiate. The fall happened in fragments, fabric against splintered railing, breath knocked from lungs, the sickening rhythm of steps against spine. Neighbors heard it. Doors opened inches, then closed again in fear. The city had trained people to survive by not seeing Dot. By the time she lay still at the bottom landing, Colaro's face had drained of color. Panic flashed through him, not remorse, but consequence. He looked around, muttered something about it being an accident, and disappeared into the night. It was Mrs. Thompson from 3B who ran down first, her house slippers slapping against wood. She knelt beside Mame, whispering her name, calling for help. And somewhere across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson felt something shift before he even knew why. When the message reached him, he did not run, he walked. Those who saw him move through the street that night described it later as something unsettling, not frantic, not explosive, controlled. His jaw set slightly tighter than usual, his eyes darker. He arrived at the apartment building to find neighbors gathered in worried clusters. No shouting, no chaos, just a heavy stillness. Mame had already been taken to the doctor's office 2 blocks away. Bumpy entered without hesitation. The doctor, an older man who had served Harlem families for decades, met him with cautious optimism. She's bruised, shaken, but strong. The child, he paused carefully. The child is alive. Bumpy closed his eyes for a brief second, not relief, not yet, but acknowledgement. He stepped into the room where Mame lay resting. She was pale but conscious. When she saw him, she reached for his hand immediately. He didn't push me because of business, she whispered. He pushed me because he thought he could. The words settled like iron. Bumpy pulled a chair beside her bed. He did not ask. Who? She told him, and when she finished, he nodded once. I see, he said quietly. There was no promise of retaliation, no declaration of revenge. Only those 2 words, I see. But in Harlem, that meant everything. News traveled swiftly through both sides of the city. By morning, Dutch Schultz had heard Dot, and Dutch Schultz was no fool. He understood politics, optics, reputation. He knew that an attack on a pregnant woman, particularly the wife of a respected Harlem figure, was not merely misconduct. It was instability, and instability invited attention from police, from rivals, from the press. Within 24 hours, a meeting was arranged, not in Harlem. Not in public. A neutral restaurant in the Bronx, closed for private dining. When Bumpy entered that back room, every man inside stood not out of affection, but recognition. He removed his hat slowly, placed it on the table, and took his seat without invitation. Dutch Schultz studied him carefully. I heard what happened, Dutch began, voice level. So did I, Bumpy replied, silence stretched. Colaro sat 2 chairs down, hands clasped too tightly. I'm told it was an accident, Dutch said. Bumpy's gaze shifted briefly to the young man, then back to Dutch. An accident implies regret. No one breathed. You believe it was deliberate? Dutch asked. I believe, Bumpy answered calmly, that a man who mistakes arrogance for strength is dangerous to everyone, including you. The room changed temperature. This was not a threat. It was insight. Dutch leaned back, considering. You asking for blood? he asked. Bumpy's voice did not rise. "I'm asking for order." Another pause. "Because if Harlem believes your organization condones harm against women," Bumpy continued, "they won't cooperate. And if they don't cooperate, things become unpredictable." Dutch's eyes narrowed slightly. He understood. Power required consent. Even silent consent. And Colaro had jeopardized it. The turning point did not come with a slammed fist. It came with Dutch Schultz standing slowly and saying only this: "Vincent, you're done. No theatrics. No violence. Just exile, removal, protection withdrawn. In that world, it was worse than a beating." Colaro began to protest, but one look from Dutch silenced him. Bumpy remained seated. Then he added something that would echo long after the meeting ended. "I don't want him hurt," Bumpy said. "I want him to understand." Dutch gave a small nod. Within 48 hours, Colaro was out. No backing, no support, no borrowed power, and something else happened. His family came to Harlem. Not to threaten. To apologize. His mother stood outside Bumpy's building with trembling hands. His younger sister avoided eye contact. They feared retaliation that never came. Bumpy stepped outside, hat in hand once more. The mother spoke first, voice breaking. He was wrong. Bumpy looked at her, not cold. Then teach him. Better, he said. That was all. No speech. No lecture. Just accountability, redirected where it belonged. Inside. Mame watched from the window. Tears did not fall because vengeance had been avoided. They fell because dignity had been preserved. Harlem noticed. The city noticed. And quietly, something shifted. That winter did not grow warmer. Racism did not disappear. Injustice did not dissolve. But a line had been redrawn. And this time, it had not been crossed. As snow continued to fall across Harlem rooftops, Bumpy Johnson stood beside his wife, hand resting gently over the life they had almost lost, and understood something deeper than power. Strength was not proven by how hard a man could strike. It was proven by how firmly he could stand, without striking at all. And somewhere in the city that so often looked away, respect had just been forced to look back. Reputation is a strange currency. In Harlem, it could protect you or bury you, sometimes in the same breath. After the stairwell incident, the neighborhood exhaled, but only briefly. People spoke of restraint with reverence, yet fear lingered beneath the praise. When violence does not erupt where it is expected, the silence that follows becomes heavier than gunfire. And in New York City, silence never lasts without consequence. Bumpy Johnson felt it immediately. The streets looked the same, but the air had changed. Men who once nodded with casual respect now watched him more carefully. Not because they doubted him, but because they were trying to understand him. Power that does not behave as predicted unsettles those who depend on predictability. Bumpy had refused vengeance, and in doing so, he had disrupted an old script written by fear. Mame noticed it too. She sensed it in the way women paused longer in conversation, in the way elders spoke his name with both admiration and concern. Strength without spectacle inspired hope, but it also invited challenge. The city had a way of testing men who claimed moral ground, especially men who looked like Bumpy Johnson. The first test arrived disguised as bureaucracy. A week after the incident, city inspectors descended on Harlem with sudden urgency. Businesses were cited for violations that had existed for years without complaint. Churches were threatened with closure over paperwork discrepancies. Food distribution routes were blocked under the guise of sanitation concerns. None of it was accidental. None of it was subtle. Bumpy stood in the back of a small grocery store as the owner, a coat of Kona, widower with 3 children, pleaded with an inspector who would not meet his eyes. The citation would shut the store down within days. It would starve not only the man's family, but half the block that relied on him for affordable food. "This isn't justice," the owner whispered to Bumpy after the inspectors left. This is punishment. Bumpy nodded. It's pressure. Pressure meant someone was pushing. And pressure always came from somewhere. The source revealed itself not through force, but through invitation. A sealed envelope arrived at Bumpy's office that evening, delivered by a man who said nothing and did not wait for acknowledgement. Inside was a simple note, typed, impersonal, efficient. Private meeting, Midtown, nitrogen monoxide escorts. No signature was necessary. Bumpy knew who had sent it. The meeting place was a private club where Harlem was never welcome unless summoned. Leather chairs, polished floors, the faint scent of expensive cigars. The kind of place where deals were not made loudly, but permanently. When Bumpy entered, conversation dimmed, not stopped, just lowered. He was not ignored. He was observed. At the far end of the room sat 3 men. Not gangsters, not politicians. Something worse. Financiers. Men whose hands never touched violence, but directed it nonetheless. One of them spoke first. Mr. Johnson, your restraint last week was admirable. Bumpy removed his hat slowly and sat. I didn't come for compliments. No, the man replied. You came because your neighborhood is being squeezed. Bumpy did not deny. We can stop that, another man said, folding his hands neatly, immediately. And the cost? Bumpy asked. The room smiled. They wanted Harlem compliant, quiet, predictable. They wanted Bumpy to become a symbol not of dignity, but of control. A man who could calm unrest when it benefited them and redirect anger away from institutions that deserved scrutiny. You'd be very well compensated, the first man added. Your family would never worry again. Bumpy's mind moved carefully. This was not an offer of partnership. It was a leash disguised as security. I've seen men accept this kind of help, Bumpy said calmly. They tend to disappear when they're no longer useful. The smiles tightened. You misunderstand, the man replied. This is stability. No, Bumpy said. This is ownership. Silence returned, sharper this time. You're in a position, the third man finally said, to make Harlem manageable or volatile. Choose wisely. Bumpy stood. My neighborhood doesn't need managing, he said quietly. It needs respect. He left without waiting for response. The retaliation was immediate. The following morning, a young boy was arrested outside a church for loitering. The next day, a schoolteacher was detained for disorderly conduct after questioning a patrol officer. Fear crept back into places where hope had begun to breathe. People started whispering that Bumpy's refusal had made things worse. That was the real cruelty, not punishment, but doubt. Mame felt it in the way neighbors avoided eye contact, in the way mothers pulled children closer when police passed. One evening, as she sat near the window again, she spoke without turning. They're trying to turn the people against you, she said. Yes, Bumpy replied. Will you fight them? He paused. Not the way they expect. The breaking point came 3 nights later. A rally was planned, unofficial, spontaneous, fueled by anger and desperation. Men spoke of marching, of confronting, of showing the city they would not be suffocated quietly. The energy was volatile, righteous, and dangerously close to chaos. Bumpy stood at the edge of the crowd as voices rose. He saw pain in their faces. Fear, exhaustion. He understood why fists clenched and tempers flared. But he also saw the trap. Violence would justify everything being done to them. He stepped forward. No stage. No microphone. Just presence. The crowd slowly quieted, not because he demanded it, but because he waited. You're angry, he said calmly. You have every right to be. Murmurs of agreement rippled. But anger is what they expect from us, he continued. They're prepared for it. They're hoping for it. Silence thickened. They want proof that we cannot govern ourselves. Bumpy said that we need to be controlled. A man shouted, so what do we do? Bumpy looked at him steadily. We show them restraint, he said. Not submission. Restraint. Confusion flickered across faces. They can arrest bodies. He continued. They can't arrest dignity. Not unless we hand it to them. He raised his voice only slightly. Go home tonight. Tomorrow, open your stores. Attend your schools. Worship openly. Let the city choke on the fact that we will not become what they accuse us of being. The crowd did not cheer. They nodded. And then, one by one, they dispersed. The next day, newspapers waited for riots that never came. City officials prepared statements they could not use. The financiers in Midtown received reports of calm where chaos had been promised, that unsettled them far more than violence ever could. Pressure eased, not because mercy had been granted, but because strategy had failed. Harlem endured. Weeks passed. Then months. Mame's pregnancy progressed safely. The city's grip loosened subtly. Not out of kindness, but respect earned the hard way. One evening, as Bumpy and Mame sat together listening to distant music float through the window, she placed his hand over her stomach. You didn't break them, she said softly. You exposed them. Bumpy nodded. Power fears clarity. Outside, Harlem breathed again, not freely, not fully, but enough to remember itself. And somewhere in the city's upper floors, men who had never walked its streets realized something uncomfortable. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not a man they could control, and he was not a man they could afford to ignore. In Harlem, strength was understood in simple terms. You protected what was yours. You responded when tested. You did not allow insult to linger unanswered. That code had survived long before Bumpy Johnson ever stepped into leadership, and it would survive long after him. But codes, like cities, evolve slowly and not without resistance. By the time spring edged its way into the city, something unsettling had begun to take shape beneath the surface. It wasn't violence, it wasn't police raids. It wasn't even the financiers in Midtown. It was doubt. Doubt is quieter than opposition. It does not shout accusations. It whispers questions. Why hasn't he struck back? Are they squeezing us? Because he let them? Has he grown too comfortable? Bumpy felt it before anyone dared speak it directly to him. He sensed it in conversations that stopped when he entered a room. In eyes that once held certainty, but now carried calculation. Mercy, he was discovering, inspired admiration in some, and suspicion in others, and suspicion, if left unaddressed, NETASTA, eases. The first real fracture came from within Harlem itself. A younger figure named Marcus Ellery had been rising in influence among restless men who felt the weight of economic pressure more acutely than philosophy. Marcus was charismatic, sharp-tongued, impatient. He had grown up watching humiliation disguised as law enforcement and discrimination disguised as policy. He did not believe in patience. He believed in force. One evening, in the back room of a jazz club thick with smoke and quiet tension, Marcus spoke loudly enough to be heard beyond his circle. Respect ain't given, he said. It's taken. Several men nodded. While we're opening shops and playing civilized, Marcus continued, they're tightening chains. The words traveled. And eventually, they reached Bumpy. He did not summon Marcus. He visited him. The meeting took place in broad daylight, on the sidewalk outside a barber shop. No secrecy. Number. Intimidation. Just presence. Marcus looked surprised, but did not retreat. You've got something to say about me, Bumpy said evenly. Marcus met his gaze. I got something to say about strategy. Then say it. A small crowd formed. Subtly, no one wanted to miss this. You think they respect restraint, Marcus said. They don't. They see it as fear. Bumpy did not flinch. Do you believe I'm afraid? Marcus hesitated, but pride carried him forward. I believe you're cautious. And you think caution is weakness. I think action changes things. Bumpy studied him carefully, not as a rival, as a reflection of what he himself might have become if anger had guided him years ago. You want action? Bumpy asked quietly. Marcus nodded once. Then understand what action costs. Marcus smirked slightly. I'm not afraid of cost. That's because, Bumpy said softly, you haven't paid one yet. The air shifted. You want a demonstration? Bumpy continued. Fine, I'll give you one. But the demonstration would not be what Marcus expected. 2 nights later, a staged confrontation unfolded. Not violent, but theatrical enough to draw attention. Marcus and his supporters planned to publicly challenge the Midtown interests by disrupting one of their controlled distribution lines. They wanted spectacle, headlines, a spark. Bumpy allowed it to begin. He stood back as Marcus's men blocked trucks, shouted slogans, and forced a standoff with hired security. The tension escalated rapidly. Police sirens wailed in the distance. The moment teetered on the edge of chaos. And then Bumpy stepped forward. He walked directly between Marcus and the security men, placing himself in the center, not defensively, but deliberately. You've made your point, Bumpy said calmly to Marcus. We're just getting started. Marcus replied. No, Bumpy answered. You're about to give them exactly what they need. The security chief, an impatient man with little understanding of Harlem's nuance, raised his voice. You've got 1 minute before we clear this by force. There it was. The invitation to violence. Marcus looked at Bumpy, eyes burning with defiance. Stand down, Bumpy said quietly. Marcus shook his head. You're proving them right. Bumpy stepped closer, close enough that only Marcus could hear the next words. You think they fear guns? He said softly. They own the guns. What they fear is exposure. Marcus frowned. You want to hurt them? Bumpy continued. Let the cameras see them attack unarmed men who are standing peacefully. Marcus's breathing slowed. The sirens grew louder. Step back, Bumpy said again, this time. Marcus obeyed. The trucks rolled through, but not before onlookers captured the confrontation. Not before witnesses documented the threat of force. Not before public pressure shifted subtly in Harlem's favor. No one was arrested. No one was beaten. But the story traveled, and something else traveled with it. Rumor. That Bumpy Johnson had orchestrated the entire display, not to defy Midtown, but to strengthen his own influence. That he had manipulated Marcus to make himself look strategic. That restraint was simply branding. The rumor was false, but it was effective. Within days, tension returned, this time directed at Bumpy himself. Even Marcus began to wonder. The true threat emerged shortly thereafter, and it did not come from Midtown. It came from betrayal. One of Bumpy's most trusted associates, a man named Harold Price, had been quietly meeting with the financiers. Not to overthrow Bumpy, but to replace him. Harold believed Harlem needed a leader more aggressive, more transactional, less philosophical. The financiers promised him backing, resources, protection. All he needed to do was fracture Bumpy's credibility. The plan was subtle. They would stage a financial discrepancy, a missing shipment blamed on Bumpy's oversight. They would imply mismanagement. They would suggest that Harlem was suffering not because of external pressure, but internal complacency, and it almost worked. When a shipment of critical supplies vanished without explanation, panic rippled through the neighborhood. Mothers worried. Shopkeepers accused. Marcus grew restless. Again, Bumpy called a meeting, not with accusation, with transparency. He stood before the community in the church basement where he had once funded roof repairs. A shipment is missing, he acknowledged calmly. And it's my responsibility. Whispers filled the room. I will find it, he continued. But until then, no one will go hungry. He had already arranged emergency provisions from alternative routes only he knew existed. Harold watched from the back of the room, waiting for anger to ignite. IDN single quotes T. Instead, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman stood up. You've never lied to us, she said. Others followed. You've kept peace. You've kept dignity. You've kept your word. Harold felt the shift. Immediately. Trust is not loud, but it is immovable once earned. The missing shipment was recovered within 48 hours, intercepted before it could be redirected. The evidence of manipulation traced back not directly to Harold, but close enough to reveal intent. Bumpy confronted him privately. No witnesses. No raised voices. Why? Bumpy asked simply. Harold swallowed hard. You're too soft. Soft? Bumpy repeated. They don't fear you anymore. Bumpy looked at him steadily. Fear fades, respect compounds. Harold had no answer. Bumpy could have exposed him publicly, ruined him, exiled him. Instead, he did something far more disarming. You're relieved of your duties, Bumpy said calmly. But you're not my enemy. Harold stared in disbelief. Learn, Bumpy added. Then decide who you want to be. It was not mercy for weakness. It was mercy for growth. And it stunned everyone who heard of it. Marcus heard too. And this time, when he approached Bumpy, there was no defiance in his voice. You could have crushed him. Marcus said. Yes, Bumpy replied. Why didn't you? Because leadership isn't about crushing, Bumpy said. It's about preventing the need to. Marcus studied him differently, now not as a cautious man, but as a strategic one. The financiers in Midtown, however, were growing impatient. Their pressure tactics had failed. Their internal disruption had failed. And now, Harlem's unity was strengthening, not fracturing. That made Bumpy dangerous in a new way. He wasn't reacting. He was stabilizing, and stability could not be bought. Late one night, as Bumpy stood alone near the window of his home, watching Harlem breathe under soft streetlight glow, Maine joined him. They'll try something bigger, she said quietly. I know. Are you ready? He looked down at her gently. I've been ready since the day they assumed I wasn't. Outside, the city moved as it always did, restless, layered, unpredictable. But beneath it all, a new understanding was taking root. Mercy was not weakness. Restraint was not surrender. And Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not a man losing control. He was a man redefining it. By the time summer settled into Harlem, the city had grown uneasy, not loud, not violent, but unsettled in the way a room becomes quiet just before something important is said. The pressure that once arrived in raids and citations now arrived through subtler channels. Delayed permits, frozen accounts, unanswered letters. The financiers in Midtown had stopped pretending this was business. It was now a contest of will. They had underestimated something fundamental. They believed power had to announce itself. Bumpy Johnson had learned long ago that real power rarely does. The first sign that something larger was coming arrived in the form of a public hearing. Ostensibly, it concerned urban zoning adjustments, a phrase vague enough to hide intent. In reality, it was a maneuver designed to fracture Harlem, permanently redrawing commercial boundaries, stripping local ownership, forcing displacement under legal disguise. No guns, no threats. Just paperwork sharp enough to bleed a neighborhood dry. The hearing would be open to the public. That was their mistake. Mame read the notice slowly at the kitchen table, her pregnancy now full and radiant, her presence grounding in a world that never stopped testing balance. She looked up at Bumpy. They want you there, she said. They just don't want you heard. Bumpy nodded. Then I'll speak anyway. The day of the hearing, the courthouse steps filled early. Harlem arrived quietly. No chants, no signs. Just people, shopkeepers, teachers, laborers, mothers, standing shoulder to shoulder. They were not there to protest. They were there to witness. Inside, the chamber hummed with restrained authority. Men in tailored suits shuffled documents. Officials spoke in careful language designed to obscure consequence. The financiers sat confidently, certain this was a formality. Bumpy entered last. No escort, no fanfare. Just presence. Some heads turned. Some did not. When his name was called, a murmur rippled through the room, not approval, not hostility, but recognition. He approached the podium with measured steps, placed his hat carefully beside him, and waited. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson, you have 5 minutes." Bumpy looked at the clock on the wall. Then he looked at the room. "I won't need them," he said calmly. That alone unsettled the chamber. He did not accuse. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He told a story. He spoke of families who had lived on the same block for generations, of businesses that fed communities when no one else would, of churches that patched roofs not with city funds, but with faith and perseverance. He spoke of laws written without understanding, and consequences felt by those never consulted. He spoke of dignity. Power, he said evenly, is not the ability to move people without their consent. It's the ability to move forward without leaving them behind. Some shifted uncomfortably. He then did something no one expected. He produced documents, carefully organized, verified, records of selective enforcement, financial ties between zoning boards and private investors, timelines that revealed intent disguised as administration. "This isn't development," Bumpy said softly. "It's displacement with a clean conscience." The room fell silent. The financiers stiffened. "You asked for order," Bumpy continued. "Harlem gave it. You asked for calm. We gave you restraint. And now you ask for compliance." He paused. "That," he said quietly, "is not governance. That is erasure." No one interrupted him, not because they were afraid, because they were listening. When he finished, he did not ask for applause. He did not demand action. He simply stepped back. The chairman swallowed hard. The hearing was adjourned. Early. Outside, the crowd waited not for celebration, but for confirmation. When Bumpy emerged, he did not raise his hand or speak immediately. He stood beside Mame, one arm steadying her as the weight of the moment settled. Reporters shouted questions. "Is this a victory?" Bumpy shook his head slightly. "It's clarity," he said. Within days, investigations began, not announced, but unavoidable. Zoning proposals stalled. Financial backers withdrew quietly. No apologies were issued. None were necessary. The city understood what had been exposed. The pressure receded, not because it was defeated, but because it had been revealed. Marcus Ellery watched it all from a distance, understanding finally what restraint could accomplish. He approached Bumpy days later, not as a challenger, but as a student. "I thought power meant force," Marcus admitted. "It does," Bumpy replied, "but force isn't always loud." Harold Price sent a letter. No excuses, just acknowledgement. Growth had begun where destruction once threatened, and Harlem breathed, not freely, but honestly. The night Mame went into labor, the city was quiet. No sirens, no shouting, just the steady rhythm of life continuing. Bumpy stood beside her, holding her hand, composed as ever but changed. When the child arrived, healthy and strong, Bumpy felt something he had never allowed himself to indulge in fully. Hope, not naive hope, earned hope. Weeks later, as he walked Harlem streets with his child cradled carefully in his arms, people nodded, not in fear, not in obligation, but in respect. Not because he had dominated the city, but because he had refused to let it dominate them. The financiers moved on to easier battles. The city found new distractions. But Harlem remembered. They remembered a man who chose restraint when violence would have been easier, who chose exposure over revenge, who understood that dignity, once defended properly, becomes contagious. Bumpy Johnson did not leave statues behind. He did not carve his name into buildings. He left something far more enduring, a standard, that power does not need to humiliate, that leadership does not need cruelty, that silence, when chosen deliberately, can speak louder than force ever could. And on the day the city finally understood that, it was already too late to forget him.